turbo engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
Advances.
questions,
Research.
technology.
Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists.
Hello and welcome to The Naked Scientists, the show where we bring you the latest breakthroughs in science, technology and medicine. Today, we're investigating the hidden disease tearing families apart.
games that are proposed for children and adolescents have a lot to do with the sorts of activities that you would do while you were gambling. So it's almost like training them or grooming them to gamble.
As many as 1.3 million Brits are estimated to be problem gamblers, addicts of an industry which rakes in annual profits of £15 billion per year in the UK alone. My name's James Titko, and this week I want to find out how just one casual flutter leads some people to rack and ruin. How can we help people for whom this has become a problem, and are betting companies taking the situation sufficiently seriously?
From Cambridge University's Institute of Continuing Education, this is The Naked Scientists.
The UK's Gambling Commission, responsible for regulating the industry in this country, recently announced that it is making changes to give people the opportunity to gamble safely while protecting people from gambling-related harms, so they say. The plans, which were set out in a white paper, include a mandatory levy on betting firms to pay for treatment of addiction and new player protection checks to catch erratic betting activity. I'll hear more about these proposals from a representative of the industry a bit later on. But first, what is it like when gambling takes hold of your life? A harmless evening out launched Bianca down a slippery slope into a gambling addiction.
I've never been somebody that's been particularly interested in gambling in any form. So my first experience of gambling wasn't actually a choice that I made. I'd actually been on a night out with a good friend of mine, and we were having so much fun that we didn't want the night to end. And the only place that was open in my local town was the casino. I sat and watched him, and I was absolutely flabbergasted. Just found the whole thing really, really interesting, and the fact that he'd been able to just put £20 into a machine and then suddenly it was turning it into something else. I felt compelled to want to do the same, and as with so many other people who have experienced gambling addiction, they start their story the same way. Of course I won, so that £20 became 100.
I mean, so far it sounds like the experience of many people, those who are able to gamble without it becoming a problem. What started to happen to make you think that something was different about your experience with gambling?
I'd say initially I didn't, because I suppose when you're still classing yourself as a social gambler, you're not seeing it as a problem because you're not spending with outside of your means, you're not getting into debt because of it, feeling the rush of it as something as part of an enjoyment. But as time went by, you start to up the stakes, you start to spend more time in the casinos. When you start to live outside of your means and you start to actually take out loans and you start to actually get into debt because of it, that's when I realised it was then becoming the problem. But by that time, I was too far in and I couldn't get out of the problem. I was a fully fledged addict. There's an element of isolation that I chose, because being in a casino, you are isolated and you're sat in front of a machine. So there really isn't anybody else to share that you're struggling with.
Bianca, do you mind me asking how much you were losing?
In the worst, darkest moments, I know I'd lost around £1,000 a week. It's the addiction and that sort of trap cycle that you get yourself into where you feel you literally can't stop going. The money I was winning, I was still choosing to put back into the machines when I actually could have been recognising that that was money that I could be using to pay off my debt, or I could be using with my family, etc. I never really have an exact figure, but I know when I actually was too far gone, it was just under £30,000 that I was in debt.
It's a vast sum of money.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine one of the hardest parts of this was the fact that you were keeping it a secret from the people close to you, your friends and family.
Absolutely. Because gambling doesn't have a physical symptom, it's very easy for us as gamblers to spend a horrible amount of money and have the real depths of low of losing. But then what I would have to do is drive home, and my husband at the time would come home from work. I would make his dinner. I would sit and ask him about his day. We would chat, and, he'd ask me about my day, and I'd say I'd been busy, I'd been to work, and I hadn't done any of those things. I've been sat in the casino. So the deceit is the thread that runs through all of it, that on top of the fact that you're losing money, you're also becoming a version of yourself that really isn't very nice. It's very, very difficult for people to understand. And that is why people do typically keep it a secret.
That was Bianca, and her story is one shared by many. Problem gamblers often report a loss of agency over their betting, where huge financial losses and the compulsion to cover them up can contribute to severe mental health difficulties and, in some cases, even suicide. But it goes deeper than just the money. Gambling changes the way our brain's reward system functions, addicting players to the rush that comes with risk-taking. I went to Clare Hall College in Cambridge to meet Barbara Sahakian, Professor of Clinical Neuropsychology and a leading expert on gambling addiction.
Addiction has to do mainly with the loss of control over your behavior. So when you aren't allowed to do something, for instance, if it's a substance of abuse like cocaine or amphetamine, you're not allowed to take it anymore. You get symptoms of withdrawal and you get cravings. The same thing actually happens in gambling. So you get irritability and craving to do the gambling. And basically what happens is it frequently starts with a level of impulsivity, where somebody impulsively tries something, and then they slowly become more and more addicted to it, such that it becomes the focus of control. And that's an important thing in gambling, that they only want to gamble. So they lose their own ability to stop gambling, but their interest is really only in that, to the neglect of other areas of life.
I suppose the critical difference with gambling as opposed to the substances you listed there is that there's nothing physically being ingested into the body which we can point to and directly to the harms that it causes. Is that possibly the reason why it's taken quite a long time for awareness of gambling as an addiction to really become mainstream? Originally,
it was classified differently in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, but now it's basically been reclassified as substance-related and addictive disorders. So it's actually considered in that category now. And I think you're right, it's because it was a behavioral addiction, but that has a lot of benefits too, because as I said, the sort of addictive triangle is kind of the loss of control, the craving and withdrawal aspects, and then the neglect of other areas of life. And with the addicted behavior that you might have to gambling, you can study that in a pure way. So you don't have alcohol problems, you don't have other substances of abuse problems such as cocaine or amphetamine. It's purely looking at the behavioral.
As I understand it, it often goes hand in hand. I know Bianca mentioned at the top of the program alcohol as a factor as to how she started gambling, and that's quite common across the board?
It is quite common across the board, and unfortunately some places use this. So if you go to a place like Las Vegas, they will often, in the casinos or hotels where there's gambling, they'll allow you to have free alcohol because, of course, it disinhibits you and it allows you to gamble more freely. But there is also, some strong relationships with alcohol and gambling. And, of course, in a lot of the addictions, there's a predisposition for impulsive behavior, which prompts them all. At Yale University, Mark Potenza and others have pointed out that there's a very strong family association and that the genetics is very important as well.
I imagine the answer will be it's a bit of both, but whether it's the person or the exposure to gambling which can cause these gambling-related harms, if we start with the exposure, what factors are there to bear in mind?
Well, there's people who are very interested in risky behavior, and they go into areas where, there's a lot of excitement and risky behavior going on. So it used to be that footballers would get involved in a lot of use of alcohol. I mean, they're more protective about that now because they realize that it's important to keep fit. But they still probably go into gambling. And as you know, it's advertised very strongly on TV and so forth when there's football matches on. So there's a lot of things to do with advertisement. We're also finding that internet gaming, games that are proposed for children and adolescents, have a lot to do with the sorts of activities that you would do while you were gambling. So it's almost like training them or grooming them to gamble in the future. So that's another problem. And then it's quite common that in families where there's gambling, then other people, younger people, will start to gamble as well. So there's environmental factors like that. There's also other environmental factors. I mean, we know that socioeconomic status can affect gambling because obviously people who don't have money are looking for money, and how you respond to stress, whether you can emotionally regulate yourself when something negative happens to you, and that kind of thing. So the sort of stresses in the environment can promote gambling as well. And we do know that there's changes, for instance, in the hippocampus and amygdala areas involved in emotional regulation, as well as your top-down control of emotion in gamblers. And so it could be that, impact of stress from various environmental sources can affect them as well.
And then when we think about it from maybe the more biological perspective or the psychological perspective, I guess that necessitates us having a better grip on the actual mechanisms of what's going on inside the brain when someone's suffering from gambling addiction. Is that an exact science at this point?
We still need a lot of research on what starts the gambling process and then how it continues. We do know quite a lot about other addictive behaviors, as you pointed out, and we do know that many of them start with a kind of impulsive act. You're sort of excited, or your friend takes you into an environment, and then you get hooked by the excitement of the whole thing. We've found that in our studies with the Cambridge Gambling Task, which I've been involved in inventing, that in some of the studies that have been done with that task, that people actually are poorer decision makers. So when the odds are against them, they will still bet, and they might bet quite highly, whereas a healthy person wouldn't do that. They would notice that the probability is against them, and then they wouldn't take that option, or they would go for a much smaller bet with that option. So we can see that there's also some poor, risky decision-making that goes on in these people who gamble.
An alarming thought, isn't it, that the online games that youngsters are playing might be nurturing a gambling instinct that they could fall victim to later. That was Barbara Sahakian at the University of Cambridge. You're listening to The Naked Scientists with me, James Titko. Today, we're talking about the harms of gambling addiction. Coming up, we'll hear about what help is out there for those suffering from the harms of gambling addiction, and hear again from Bianca about her recovery. But first, what does the gambling industry have to say about this? And what measures are being put in place to make sure they're taking a more active role in helping problem gamblers? Dan Waugh is a partner at gambling consultants Regulus. He previously worked as a director at the Rank Group, which is the UK's leading operator of casinos and bingo clubs.
Placing bets on betting websites is perfectly legal, so I don't think the activity is to stop people doing it. The focus of activity has to make sure that people are doing it, they're fully informed of what they're doing, and that protections are in place to prevent vulnerable people from suffering harm.
How do you answer the challenge that the relevant demographic here when it comes to the gambling industry are these problem gamblers? A huge amount of their revenues are derived from people who suffer harms related to gambling. And so it's not in their interests to address gambling related harms, and we need to force them with stricter regulations.
I would say any industry that is not focused on the well-being of its consumers will not last as an industry for very long. So I think it would be incredibly short-sighted and misguided if the industry was focusing on problem gamblers. I don't think they are, and I think we've seen various claims about the proportion of revenue that comes from problem gamblers. I think they are demonstrably unreliable. We would expect some people with problem gambling to spend more than the average, but I think the idea that the industry is dependent upon revenues from problem gamblers is is unsupported by any hard data.
According to research from the University of Liverpool, when it comes to online gambling, 86% of profits come from 5% of customers. And I put it to you that those are people who are likely to be suffering from harms of gambling, and it not necessarily being in the industry's interest to deal with problem gamblers. They were very reliant on them to make themselves viable businesses.
Yeah, well, look, that figure's from a very, very high quality study of about 140,000 online betting accounts. It relates to online sports betting alone. An important point has to be made here when you're looking at these distributions is that unlike most other activities, a meaningful proportion of people who bet will end up in profit. And in that particular study, I think 23% of the accounts they studied were actually in profit over the course of the year. So that automatically skews the distribution. I think from memory, it was about £83 a month to be included in that top 5%. So I don't think the fact that a large proportion of revenues are coming from a small proportion of customers is necessarily an issue. A bigger issue is whether the industry is generating large amounts of revenue from people who are experiencing harm. And I don't think that that study at the University of Liverpool would be able to inform you one way or the other about that.
Okay, but let's talk about the people who are daily spending hundreds or even thousands of pounds using online betting websites. What's being done to curtail that and to stop the related harms?
So under the regulations, online operators have a requirement to monitor customer activity in order to identify potentially harmful behaviour. The government has consulted and the Gambling Commission have consulted on bringing in what are called affordability checks. Thresholds will be set across the industry which indicate at what levels operators have to interact with consumers.
What are the proposed thresholds on those affordability checks?
Yes, the proposed thresholds are that anybody spending more than £1,000 within a 24-hour period or more than £2,000 over a 90-day period would be subject to extra checks to ensure that the money they were spending was theirs and was affordable.
So they kick in at £1,000 a day, £2,000 across 90 days. Would this just be for that one particular website the customer is using, or is this tracked across all betting sites? So to put it another way, could someone lose £900 across 3 days on 3 different websites, which I would argue is a strong sign of problem gambling, and slip through the net of these checks?
Yes, that could certainly happen. The operators' checks take place at the level of the operator. If somebody's betting with Paddy Parron, also betting with William Hill, the operators wouldn't see the full picture. That's certainly the case. I don't know whether necessarily somebody spending £3,000 across 3 operators is necessarily a sign of problem gambling. It would certainly indicate elevated risk. You know, this is the only form of consumer activity where these tests are applied. So there's always got to be a balance between these things. And generally, consumers don't like providing things like bank statements and tax returns in order to spend their money. So I think it's important to recognise there is a balance here, and this is quite a unique system that's being proposed.
There really seems to be no shortage of gambling companies and ways of gambling out there. I mean, half the Premier League teams have one company or another on their shirts as of fairly recently. And with all the sign-up offers that are very attractive to new customers, that's why I wanted to raise this point.
I think all bar one maybe of the Premier League sponsors are overseas gambling websites that nobody in this country would use. They're being marketed to people in Asia or Africa. And also the Gambling Commission is taking action as a result of the government's white paper on things like sign-up bonuses. So the idea that, you know, there is no regulation around this stuff or it's very light touch regulation has started to change somewhat. And if you look at the full range, particularly the full range of measures that are coming out of the white paper, I think you say that, you know, the environment for the gambling consumer is changing into a very much more restrictive one. And these things should be borne into mind when you're thinking about what is appropriate regulation and what are the balances between protecting some people and allowing freedom to others. You could, for example, make a similar argument that pub companies should track alcohol consumption because some people do experience negative consequences in that domain. So I think we've always got to balance what is appropriate and proportionate in a free society.
That was Dan Waugh at gambling consultants Regulus. As always, we're interested to hear what you think about the topics we cover here on The Naked Scientists. The email is chris@thenakedscientists.com. Now, part of the new plans from the UK government to tackle problem gambling forces betting companies to help fund treatment for people suffering from the associated harms. But where is that money going? What sort of help is on hand? Emma Ryan, who is a lead GP at the UK's first primary care gambling service, a free confidential NHS service for adults who experience problems with gambling, spoke to me when I went to meet her in East London. She also works with the charity Gamble Aware.
In the UK, for those experiencing gambling harms, only 5% are in treatment. So I suppose the message we're trying to get across is that we need to raise awareness that if you're experiencing gambling harm, that you can get help, because there is support out there, but we need to identify individuals to get them into the support and treatment services.
That chimes really strongly with what Bianca was telling us at the top of the programme, the fact that she felt that so few people around her understood or could even comprehend the idea that gambling could be an addiction.
Gambling is quite unique compared to other addictions because it's often referred to as a hidden addiction. And when we speak to patients that come through our service, I think that's one of the issues, that people don't come forward early, they present late. And so our overall aim is to really raise awareness to everyone, that to think about gambling in people that are unwell early so that we can get them into support and treatment early.
When someone does come to you, when you've got through that first hurdle, almost the hardest one, it sounds like, of getting them into treatment, what are the first steps there?
What we have to do initially is to stress that it's confidential, stress that there's no judgment, and really work on explaining that this is an addiction because of the products and the exposure that individuals are getting to it, and a no blame assessment, really. And then in terms of treatment, there's lots and lots of options. The mainstay of treatment for gambling harms is cognitive behavioural therapy. When we do the initial assessment, there's often a pattern where people have been through significant childhood trauma. So if that's the case, where we assess someone and they've been through the system maybe more than 2 or 3 times, we would put them with a psychotherapist. And that's much longer, that's 20 sessions. That's the mainstay of clinical treatment.
And I imagine, given the way other addictions are treated, is there also scope for group therapies, opportunity to speak to people with similar experiences?
Absolutely, and they are as important as the clinical therapy, and often where the patient wants it, we offer that at the same time. So what we find is that when patients arrive, they're extremely isolated because they're just focused on the gambling. So they've lost their friends, their family aren't speaking to them, they've lost their colleagues at work. So it's really important where they're ready to link them in, if possible, with a lived experience advisor, someone that's been through this and is now better, because that gives hope and gives real understanding and empathy for the person going through it. The other thing with GPs that we're trying to raise awareness around is the use of social prescribers. They're local to where people live, and they can advise on activities which takes up the gambling space, if you like. So if somebody's spending hours gambling each day, they're now free if they're trying to stop. So we're able to link them into communities in their local area where they live, whether that be walking groups, art classes. We've given cookery courses. So it's really trying to move the mindset of the person experiencing harms to start living again, really.
And in terms of drug treatments, are there any of those that are applicable in the case of gambling addiction?
Well, historically and currently, the main one that you'll hear doctors and clinical workers talk about is now Trexone. And basically, we did discuss this in the NICE guidelines, and it's not widely used, and in order to use it you would need to know the full medical history of the individual, because it can have effects on the kidney and the liver, and it also needs blood monitoring. So when it's considered is if someone has relapsed 2 or 3 times with psychological therapy and they really need something else. So it would be used in a specialist setting. It's off license and off label. So it's not to be used in clinics where there's not a specialist input really from a consultant psychiatrist. So it is there. In the NICE guidelines, we have mentioned it, but it's in the recommendation for further research, because what's interesting about it is that we don't know which people it's going to work on. So some people, they do improve and no longer gamble and don't get the urge to gamble, whereas for others, it doesn't work at all.
Emma Ryan. Earlier in the programme, we heard from gambling addict Bianca. She did seek help and now regards herself as in recovery.
So there's been a few points during my life through addiction where I've realised that it was overtaking my life and my mental health. And at those points I had self-excluded, but the regulations in the industry do make it very easy for you to go back. So until you find that inner strength, I was very fortunate to become a first and second time mum during lockdown, of which a woman in my 40s, James, I never expected to happen. So I was so grateful to beautiful children. Thank you. Even at that point, I was still gambling. You know, I'd moved to online because it was lockdown. So that hit was still there. It just wasn't physically in the casinos. What I realised was that I actually had purpose outside of the casino. I didn't want to be in there. And I started to feel guilt. And that's nothing against anybody that was previously in my life before my children, because that's not to say I love them any less, but they gave me a sense of purpose that I think I'd always longed for in my life, where gambling suddenly started to seem somewhat dirty and I started to feel ashamed of myself and embarrassed to be there.
But did you get any help from outside while you've been in recovery?
I didn't actually go through a traditional therapy route until more recently, because I'm quite a headstrong person, and I kind of felt like if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this myself, which I don't advocate. I think it's just my personality. So I completely banned myself from any form of gambling that's based in the United Kingdom. I also registered with the West Midlands Gambling Recovery Service, who've been fantastic. So yeah, there are a lot of tools out there, but in my own personal opinion, not enough.
How are things now? You're in recovery. Is it still very much a prominent thing in your mind, the drive to gamble, or has it subsided somewhat since you've stopped doing it? How is it day to day?
I am a realist, James. Although I'm a year into my recovery journey, this is part of me that took over my life for 12, 13 years. So I would be lying if I said there wasn't a day that went by that I didn't think about gambling. The urges that I have are really, really strong. And the ability to break a habit that you've had that's been part of your daily life for such a long time isn't going to happen overnight. I strongly feel proud to say that I will be in recovery for the rest of my life, but I am no longer an addict. I don't yet feel that there are enough people around me that understand my addiction fully, and I do believe that there should be more support out there for affected others. But I believe from my own boundary perspective, I am able to manage that, and I haven't set foot in a casino, or I haven't gambled now for over a year, which is something that I'm very, very proud of. But yeah, absolutely, to answer your question, I still think about it every day.
Thank you to Bianca for sharing her story with us. Gambling addiction can affect anyone, as we've been hearing, literally taking control over the behaviour of its victims. Although for many, betting can be an enjoyable and safe activity, for some, the phrase safer gambling is a complete contradiction in terms. As such, stricter regulations on the promotion and practices of betting companies has been deemed necessary to prevent harm to problem gamblers, and time will tell if they deliver the intended effects. One of the things that surfaced several times in my conversations for this programme is the isolation that victims often experience, which can conspire to make the problem worse. GamCare offers a range of options for people struggling with the impact of gambling, either for themselves or their loved ones. They offer support over the phone, face-to-face or online, and their treatment is free, flexible and confidential. Call GamCare's free 24/7 National Gambling Helpline on 0808 8020 133 or visit gamcare.org.uk. That's all for this time. Next week, we're going back to our roots, asking whether reforestation schemes to tackle climate change are barking up the wrong tree. The Naked Scientists comes to you from the University of Cambridge's Institute of Continuing Education. It's supported by Rolls-Royce. I'm James Titko, and from everyone here at The Naked Scientists, thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.